The sound arrives before the men do. A cane striking teak planking, slow, deliberate, slightly uneven, crossing the deck of a battleship anchored in Tokyo Bay on a gray September morning. Around it, silence. Not the silence of an empty ship, but the silence of hundreds of men who have chosen not to speak. No fanfare, no music, no salute. They did not bow. 11 men in morning coats and military dress, representing the defeated Empire of Japan, crossed the deck of the USS Missouri on the morning of September 2nd, 1945. With their backs rigid, their faces stone, and not a single gesture of deference to the assembled Allied admirals and generals, watching them in complete silence. In Japanese culture, a bow is not merely etiquette. It is the external acknowledgement of a relationship. Who stands above? Who stands below? What exists between them? These men are communicating something precisely. They will sign the papers. They will not surrender their souls. The most powerful military officer in the Pacific is watching. He has just won the bloodiest war in human history. He can demand anything. What he chooses to do, or not to do, will determine what the next decade looks like for 40 million people. Tokyo Bay on this morning holds 280 Allied warships, battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, stretching to the horizon in every direction, every ship at anchor, every crew watching the Missouri. The flags of the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China move in a slight offshore breeze above the battleship's deck. The sky is overcast, flat and gray. There is no triumphant Pacific sunshine. The Missouri is the newest battleship in the American fleet, 45,000 tons, commissioned barely a year ago, named for the home state of the man who ordered what is about to happen here. Her teak deck has been meticulously arranged for the ceremony. A long mess table draped in green felt, positioned toward the forward turret, where the surrender documents will be signed. The documents themselves were printed on parchment found in a basement in ruined Manila. One copy bound in gold for the Allied powers, one bound in black for Japan. Every element of this morning was chosen by people who knew that history would study every frame. Above the proceedings, carefully mounted for maximum visibility, is a flag that has not seen open air in many decades. The personal flag of Commodore Matthew Perry, the same flag he flew when he sailed 4 ships into this same bay in 1853 and forced Japan to open its doors to the outside world. It was brought from its permanent home at the United States Naval Academy specifically for this morning. The rhyme is deliberate. The Americans who opened Japan are now completing the sentence. Before the Japanese delegation arrived, the officers of the Allied High Command gathered in the flag wardroom of Admiral William Halsey, the Missouri's host, the man who once promised publicly to ride Emperor Hirohito's white horse through the streets of Tokyo. The leather saddle he had prepared for that purpose sits in one corner of his cabin, unclaimed. Halsey and General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz ate coffee and cinnamon rolls and waited for the morning to begin. MacArthur is 65 years old today. He stands approximately 6'1", lean with a jaw that photographs well and dark eyes that subordinates have described over the years as either commanding or unnerving depending on which side of his attention they found themselves. He's wearing no medals, no ribbons, no decorations of any kind. He wears an open-collar khaki uniform, no tie, and his signature cap, crushed, sun-faded, the brim curved low, the cap of a man who has been campaigning for years and wants you to know it. On the most watched stage of his career, he is dressed as if for a headquarters briefing. This is not carelessness. Nothing MacArthur does is careless. He has understood since at least Leyte Gulf that he is a figure in his own mythology, and he tends that mythology with a craftsman's precision. The studied nonchalance of the open collar, no decorations, no ceremony dress. On a morning when the Japanese delegation will arrive in top hats and morning coats is a costume decision as deliberate as any he has ever made. He is trembling. The hands holding his prepared remarks shake slightly in the gray air. Documented by Life magazine. Correspondence on deck. On this morning, with this particular sheet of paper, the only involuntary thing in him has broken through. He arrived in Japan 4 days ago, landed at Atsugi airfield, then rolled into Yokohama through 30,000 Japanese soldiers lining the road at arms. In any previous era, an honor guard of 30,000 would have been reserved exclusively for the emperor. The protocol of deference had already shifted, and not a word needed to be exchanged about it. He is now based in the Dai-ichi Insurance Company building in Tokyo, from whose 6th-floor windows he can look directly across a broad boulevard at the palace of Hirohito. Truman has already appointed him Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, effectively the viceroy of a conquered nation. Today is not merely the ceremony that ends the war. It is MacArthur's first public act in a new role. 3 years ago, he left the Philippines in a PT boat in the dead of night while Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright's garrison fought on at Corregidor. He made a promise when he left. I shall return. He spent 3 years keeping it, island by island, campaign by campaign, through New Guinea and Leyte and Luzon, until the morning arrived when he could stand here, on this deck, in these khakis, with these trembling hands, and preside over the formal end of the war he had been handed in catastrophe. He has studied Japanese culture carefully enough to understand, with precision, what it costs the men crossing this deck to be here. He is choosing his response with full awareness of what it means. The 11 Japanese delegates arrive at 8:56 in the morning. They are led by Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, and what announces them is the same sound that announced this morning. His cane on the teak, slow and deliberate. Shigemitsu is 58 years old. He walks on a prosthetic leg. His right was destroyed below the knee in 1932, when a Korean independence activist threw a bomb at a Japanese military ceremony in Shanghai. He wears a black morning coat and top hat, the formal dress of a diplomat, and every step across this deck is visible effort. He is not a militarist. He has been, for much of this war, among those within the Japanese government who sought a negotiated peace. Standing here on this leg, he represents both the government that failed to prevent the catastrophe and the diplomatic tradition that ultimately arranged its conclusion. Behind him, in full dress uniform, stands General Yoshijiro Umezu, Chief of the Army General Staff. Umezu is powerfully built, close-cropped, his face a controlled mask above a tunic hung with decorations. He walks with his hands at his sides. He does not speak. 2 weeks ago, Umezu stood in the Imperial Conference and argued that Japan should fight to the last man on the home islands rather than accept the Potsdam Declaration. The Emperor overruled him. Senior Japanese officials then had to persuade Umezu that his presence here today was an imperial obligation, not a choice, not a capitulation of his own spirit, but a duty owed to the Emperor who had commanded surrender. He is here because he could not refuse a direct imperial summons. He has not stopped being the man who refused everything else. His aides will weep when he signs. He will not. The Allied officers watch the delegation cross the deck and say nothing. Not a salute from any of the admirals or generals ranked along the rail. The silence is collective and deliberate. There will be no martial courtesy extended. The silence is the statement. MacArthur steps to the microphone at 9:02 in the morning. He is tense and expressionless. His voice, when he begins, is sonorous and formal, a voice that has addressed armies. He calls on those assembled to rise above hatred, malice, or distrust, to rise to that higher dignity which alone benefits the sacred purposes we are about to serve. The paper shakes slightly in his hands. The words carry over the flat water of the bay. Then he steps back from the microphone, and it is time. Shigemitsu approaches the table at 9:05. He removes his top hat. He removes his gloves. A process made slow and difficult by the prosthetic leg, the unfamiliar deck, the weight of formal dress in the grey morning air. He sits, he searches his pockets. He finds a pen, then apparently loses his certainty about where to place it. He studies a watch on one wrist. He draws a second watch and studies that. Around the table, Allied officers are still. MacArthur's expression does not change. The pause extends, then extends further. Allied eyewitnesses are reading deliberate obstruction, a final silent act of defiance, a foreign minister refusing to move until moved. Shigemitsu's own later account will suggest something different, that he was genuinely uncertain which line on the document corresponded to the Japanese government's signature, that the physical mechanics of sitting, removing gloves, and locating the correct position on a large formal document were simply, in that moment, on that leg, genuinely difficult. Both things are happening simultaneously. MacArthur cannot see Shigemitsu's reality. Shigemitsu cannot see MacArthur's reading of him. In the grey morning air above Tokyo Bay, defiance and confusion occupy the same moment, invisible to each other. MacArthur turns to his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Richard K. Sutherland. Sutherland, show him where to sign. 7 words, quietly delivered. Not a demand, not a rebuke. An instruction given to a subordinate, as if directing a clerk to assist a confused visitor with a form. Sutherland moves to the table. Shigemitsu signs, then Umezu. He marches forward from the Japanese delegation, does not approach, does not step, marches, and leans over the table without sitting. He does not look at MacArthur. He does not look at the Allied representatives standing across the green felt. He writes his name on both documents, signing standing, leaning forward, his back straight and rigid throughout. He straightens. He renders a stiff military salute, the minimum required acknowledgement of a military ceremony, and withdraws. MacArthur receives it without returning it, without comment, without acknowledgement. Behind Umezu, his aides are weeping. Umezu himself is stone. Now MacArthur steps to the table to sign for all the Allied powers. Before he picks up the first pen, he pauses. He speaks 2 names, Wainwright, Percival. He invites them to step forward beside him while he signs. Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, who commanded the garrison at Corregidor after MacArthur departed in March 1942, who surrendered in May of that year, who spent 3 years in Japanese captivity, who was liberated only weeks before this morning, moves to stand at MacArthur's shoulder. Beside him, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, who presided over the fall of Singapore in February 1942, Churchill's worst disaster, 3 years a Japanese prisoner, takes his place. Both men are gaunt, both are visibly aged past their years. 3 years of imprisonment are written into their faces. MacArthur signs his name in pieces, switching pens deliberately. The first pen he gives to Wainwright, the second to Percival. The men who had been made to bow are now watching the men who forced that bow sign the surrender. MacArthur uses 6 pens in all. The last, plum-colored, goes to his wife. The Allied signatures follow in order. Nimitz for the United States, then representatives of China, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, New Zealand. The Canadian signs on the wrong line. The error is noticed and not corrected. It remains in the historical document permanently. A small bureaucratic error in a ceremony designed for the ages, uncorrected and preserved. Then, at 9:25 in the morning, the sky fills. The B-29 superfortresses come in formation, the same aircraft, the same engines that burned Tokyo in the firebombing raids that carried the bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They filled the overcast sky above the bay with the sound of the war that just ended, and below them the carrier planes follow in their hundreds. The roar passes over the anchored fleet and over the green felt table and over the 11 men from Japan standing in their morning coats and dress uniforms, and then it fades east. MacArthur steps to the microphone one final time. Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always. 23 minutes. The ceremony is closed. MacArthur did not demand a bow. He did not comment on the absence of one. He issued no rebuke when the Japanese delegation crossed the deck with rigid backs and stone faces. He offered no acknowledgement that their bearing was anything other than expected. When Shigemitsu delayed at the table, for whatever reason, defiant or confused or both, MacArthur's response was 7 words to a subordinate. Then he moved on. The answer to the morning's central question is almost nothing. His response to their stiffness was his own stiffness, expressionless, clipped, efficient. He processed the delegation the way a judge processes defendants, without rancor, without any gesture that might have given their defiance the dignity of confrontation. The calculation is precise. A demand for deference would have made their refusal meaningful. A small act of resistance worth having, a moment that could be taken home and preserved. By treating their bearing as irrelevant, MacArthur denied it, meaning entirely. He gave them nothing to push against. The contempt in the Sutherland order is in its quietness, and it is perfectly calibrated. He did not address Shigemitsu. He addressed a subordinate. He made Shigemitsu a problem to be administratively resolved, not an adversary to be engaged. He had studied Japanese culture carefully enough to understand exactly what it cost these men to stand where they were standing. He made that cost invisible. He gave them no mirror in which to see their own defiance reflected back as something significant. Without that mirror, the defiance had nowhere to go. There is a tradition, reported but unverifiable, that MacArthur privately told aides he found the Japanese delegation's bearing admirable. It cannot be confirmed, but it is true to the psychology of the man. To admire the rigidity of the men he was processing without acknowledgement is exactly the kind of double movement MacArthur was capable of. Full understanding, zero concession. This was not instinct, it was method. 3 weeks later, MacArthur receives Emperor Hirohito at the American Embassy in Tokyo. It is their first meeting. Hirohito arrives in severe black formal attire. Morning coat, white gloves, top hat. The dress of absolute imperial ceremony. MacArthur meets him in slightly rumpled khaki. Open collar, no tie. The same posture, the same costume, the same studied casualness he wore on the Missouri's deck. A photographer from Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers headquarters captures the 2 men standing side by side, the diminutive emperor in his severe black formality, slightly stooped, the tall American general in his khakis, at ease. The Japanese government moves immediately to ban the photograph's publication. The occupation authorities overturn the ban. The image runs in every newspaper in Japan. The Missouri playbook applied again. MacArthur did not demand a bow from Hirohito any more than he demanded one from Umezu or Shigemitsu. He simply appeared, underdressed, taller, and let the frame speak. The power communicated itself without being demanded. The fact that the Japanese government tried to suppress the image, and failed, demonstrates how completely MacArthur understood what he was doing. The photograph was the ceremony. The ceremony was the photograph. Both were versions of the same argument. The relationship between these 2 nations is now visible, and you cannot control what it looks like. He ran Japan for 5.5 years. He did not impose military rule, as had been done in Germany. He indicated what he desired, let the Japanese government write its own laws, and trusted them to carry them out. Under his oversight, Japan drafted a liberal constitution, rebuilt its economy, and dismantled the military apparatus that had killed tens of millions across Asia. He ran the country from that 6th-floor office with a view of the imperial palace, and he treated the occupation the way he had treated the ceremony, with the confidence of a man who understood that power, deployed correctly, does not need to raise its voice. General Yoshijiro Umezu was tried before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, convicted as a Class A war criminal, sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in Sugamo prison in 1949. Never released, never reconstructed. The man with the most rigid posture on the Missouri's deck. The man who fought hardest not to be there, who signed without sitting, who did not weep while his aides did, was the most completely consumed by what that morning represented. His defiance, so carefully maintained, changed nothing about his fate. Mamoru Shigemitsu was also convicted at the Tokyo Tribunal and sentenced to 7 years. He was paroled in 1950. He returned to Japanese politics and, in the mid-1950s, he served again as Foreign Minister of Japan. The man who fumbled at the signature table, confused or defiant, the question was never settled, found his way back. Jonathan Wainwright received the Medal of Honor. He was promoted to full general. He died in 1953. Arthur Percival retired, wrote his memoirs, and died in 1966. Admiral John McCain, who watched the Japanese sign from the deck that morning, died 4 days after the ceremony. His heart, by then, was exhausted. MacArthur was fired by Truman in April 1951 for publicly contradicting the president's Korean War policy. When his plane landed in San Francisco, 250,000 people came to the airport. He addressed a joint session of Congress and nearly caused a riot. He died on April 5, 1964. He had outlasted the war, outlasted the occupation, outlasted Korea, and died still insisting he had been right about everything. He never demanded a bow, not from Shigemitsu, not from Umezu, not later from Hirohito. He arranged the frame, told his chief of staff to show the confused man where to sign, and gave the pens to the men who had paid the highest price to be there. Then he went to work. The bow was never the point. The surrender of the spirit was never possible. MacArthur knew that. What was possible and what he built was something else. A Japan that no longer needed to fight. The gray morning holds above Tokyo Bay. The Armada sits at anchor. On the teak deck, the green felt table stands empty, the documents already gone. Somewhere in the overcast sky, the last of the B-29s is fading east.